When Charlotte Nolan appeared at a remote health clinic on the outskirts of Sedona in late fall, she was barely recognizable, gaunt, exhausted, with vacant eyes, and her hand clutching an old metal key. The high school girl had been missing for 2 years from the familiar dusty red roads of the desert town, the one whom family and police once believed would never return. But what chilled the medical staff and investigators to the bone wasn't just her physical collapse. The most terrifying part was what Charlotte began to recount about those 2 years, about a locked-down space, about prolonged control, and about how she had survived in silence while the whole world thought she was gone forever. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the afternoon of September 17, 2016, the student pedestrian area on the southern edge of Sedona carried its usual quiet but somewhat isolated feel, where gravel-strewn patches alternated between red rock formations and narrow roads winding through sparse residential areas, typically filled only with the solitary footsteps of students heading home after school and the dry hot wind blowing across the rock slopes. Charlotte Nolan, 16 years old, left the local high school campus at her familiar time, when most students had already scattered in different directions to head home, and the route she chose was no different from hundreds of previous afternoons. Charlotte grew up in a single-parent household with just her and her mom, living in a single-story house a short distance from the town center, where daily life followed stable and predictable routines, and coming straight home after school was practically an unspoken rule. According to school records and confirmations from those who knew her, Charlotte had no history of skipping school, wasn't involved in troubled relationships, and rarely changed personal plans without notice, making her schedule clear and easy to track. That afternoon, Charlotte carried her usual backpack, wore normal school clothes, and showed no signs of unease or hurry as she left campus, an image consistent with a high school girl on her way home after an ordinary school day. The intended route Charlotte used was a pedestrian path, cutting through a sparse residential area, then connecting to a small road leading straight home, a route her family considered safe because it was regularly used by people during after-school hours and had no record of any serious incidents for many years. The moment Charlotte turned away from the more crowded area to step onto this familiar stretch was seen and confirmed by several classmates, and it was also the last time she appeared in public. No argument, no signs of coercion, and no behavior suggesting she was intentionally deviating from her usual routine. As the afternoon faded into evening, and the Sedona sunlight quickly disappeared behind the red rock formations, Charlotte's mother began to notice that her daughter still hadn't come home at the usual fixed time, something rare because Charlotte always let her know in advance if there was any delay. The first calls were made with growing worry, but still exploratory. However, the phone went unanswered, messages received no reply, and there was no indication that Charlotte had changed her evening plans. Time continued to pass in prolonged silence, and when darkness fully enveloped the outskirts of Sedona, the family began to rule out ordinary possibilities, calling Charlotte's close friends, reviewing the day's schedule, and confirming that no extracurricular activity, meetup or sudden event had been planned. Charlotte's failure to appear that evening, leaving no note or explanation, gradually registered with the family as a serious anomaly, completely unlike the rare delays that had happened before. When the clock passed the point where Charlotte was normally home, and all personal contact efforts yielded nothing, the absence of a 16-year-old girl with no clear reason could no longer be seen as a puzzling delay. It became a cause for alarm. After confirming that no normal routine scenario could explain Charlotte not coming home that night, her mother made the decision to call the police, officially reporting her daughter missing. This marked the moment when what seemed like an ordinary afternoon in Sedona ended with Charlotte Nolan's absence recorded in the system as a missing person case of unknown cause, closing out the day with a sudden void in the life of her family and the surrounding community. After the missing person report was received on the evening of September 17, 2016, the Sedona Police Department immediately activated the protocol for handling missing minors, treating it as a case requiring rapid response, even though no elements indicating criminal activity had surfaced yet. Initial information recorded included full name Charlotte Nolan, 16 years old, physical description, last known clothing, time she left school, intended route home, along with daily habits, confirmed by family as stable and rarely changing. In the first few hours, patrol units were dispatched to sweep the area around the family's residence, while checking the familiar pedestrian route Charlotte usually took, including narrow stretches winding through sparse residential areas, trails connecting open lots, and spots hidden from view due to the distinctive red rock terrain of Sedona. The initial search radius was set to expand gradually from the high school to the family home, then outward to adjacent areas, based on the possible distance a teenage girl could have traveled in the time elapsed since last contact. The following day, authorities coordinated with the county search and rescue team, local park staff, and community volunteers to conduct systematic ground searches, dividing the area into search grids to ensure no checked location was overlooked, while carefully logging the time, lighting conditions, and results of each sweep. Familiar student routes, small parking lots, roadside areas, and commonly used shortcuts were all thoroughly examined, but no evidence emerged, suggesting a sudden incident had occurred. In parallel with field searches, police interviewed family members to clarify Charlotte's living context in the days leading up to her disappearance, focusing on her school schedule, personal relationships, communication habits, and any changes in mood or behavior that might guide the search. Follow-up interviews expanded to close classmates, subject teachers, homeroom teachers, and school counselors, with the goal of gathering objective assessments of her mental state, academic pressures, social conflicts, or any unusual signs if present. The information collected during this phase showed that Charlotte had no history of truancy, was not involved in serious disputes with friends or teachers, and had not expressed any intention to leave her familiar environment. Police also reviewed public transportation data, bus stops near the school and surrounding areas, while checking traffic cameras and private security cameras at points likely to have captured Charlotte passing by, but the footage obtained only confirmed she had left the school area in the familiar direction, without providing any specific additional leads. Notably, throughout the initial search period, authorities found no scene of violence, recorded no signs of a struggle or accident, and recovered no personal items left along the route, evidence that often quickly narrows down cases involving criminal elements or unexpected incidents. The absence of direct physical evidence kept investigative hypotheses cautious, focusing on more common possibilities, rather than jumping to early assumptions of criminal activity. Summarized reports from the early days noted that all gathered information remained indirect and insufficient to establish a clear scenario, forcing the investigative team to maintain an open approach, continue broad area searches, and simultaneously prepare for the possibility of a prolonged case. Although active participation from the local community helped expand resources and sustain search momentum in the initial phase, the results achieved did not alter the authorities' preliminary assessment that, at this point, there were no clear signs of crime connected to Charlotte Nolan's absence, and all operations continued within the framework of an undetermined cause missing person case, where the lack of specific leads left the process, despite being urgent and organized, still stuck in a prolonged stalemate. After many weeks of continuous searching since the time Charlotte Nolan was reported missing, the Sedona Police Department conducted a comprehensive review of all collected results to determine the next course of action for the case, in a context where every effort to expand the search scope had failed to produce any breakthrough leads. Reports from search and rescue teams, patrol units, and local volunteers showed that key areas around the familiar pedestrian route, sparse residential zones, open lots, trails, and intersections had been checked multiple times at different points throughout the day, but no signs emerged, indicating that Charlotte had suffered an accident, been injured, or left behind personal items that could help pinpoint her last location. The absence of a violent scene, no traces of a struggle, and no recorded unusual disturbances in the surrounding environment, severely limited the ability to identify a specific scenario, forcing the investigative team to acknowledge that the physical data typically used to clarify similar cases was completely absent here. In parallel with the field evaluation, police re-examined all interviews conducted with family, classmates, teachers, and anyone who had contact with Charlotte in the days leading up to her disappearance, but no direct witness could provide information beyond the previously confirmed timeline, and no one reported any behavior, statements, or situations suggesting Charlotte was in danger right before she vanished. The lack of independent witnesses and physical evidence required the case to be handled strictly under its original legal classification as a missing person case, with the focus on determining the prolonged absence of a teenage girl under conditions that did not yet meet the elements of a criminal offense. Per internal procedures, after active search operations yielded no results over a significant period, the case was shifted to long-term monitoring status, meaning the frequency of proactive searches was gradually reduced, resources were reallocated to other urgent matters, and ground checks were only conducted when new information surfaced. This change did not reflect the case being forgotten, but was a consequence of the lack of new data sufficient to justify maintaining the initial level of mobilization, given limited resources and the vast terrain of the Sedona area. During this phase, Charlotte's family continued to play an active role in monitoring and providing piecemeal information to authorities, including reporting any calls, messages, rumors, or indirect tips that might be relevant, though most proved unverifiable or led to no specific leads. The file was periodically updated with this information, but each review produced similar results, no new elements strong enough to alter the initial assessment. In the process of systematizing the case's background data, investigators compiled a list of individuals with close family or social ties to Charlotte to ensure every relationship was fully documented in the file, even without signs of suspicion. Among them, Elliot Pike, the ex-husband of Charlotte's mother, was noted as a figure in the family context due to the prior marriage and shared history with the family. But at this point, there was no evidence or information indicating he was directly involved in the disappearance, and his name appeared only in the background data section to fully reflect the personal relationships surrounding the victim. This notation was purely procedural, and did not come with any in-depth investigative actions, consistent with the overall assessment that the case lacked typical indicators of intentional criminal behavior. As time continued to pass without a breakthrough, Charlotte Nolan's file gradually moved into the category of unresolved missing persons cases, commonly referred to internally as a cold case, a status reflecting the reality that every avenue of active search had been pursued and evaluated within the available data, but produced no definitive outcome. This transition marked a new phase of the case, where Charlotte's prolonged absence was monitored through periodic updates and community feedback, while authorities kept the file open but no longer had the capacity to advance progress through proactive search measures, leaving the matter suspended between unproven hypotheses and the family's extended wait, in a context where no concrete evidence had emerged strong enough to break the deadlock formed after many weeks of initial investigation. Nearly 2 years after the day Charlotte Nolan vanished from her familiar route in Sedona, without leaving any trace or explanation, on a morning in early October of 2018, the small health clinic, located on the western outskirts of Sedona, suddenly became the site of an event far beyond any ordinary situation the facility had ever handled. It was a clinic that mainly served residents scattered around the outlying areas and hikers dealing with minor health issues, while trekking among the red rock formations, where shifts typically unfolded in a steady and predictable atmosphere. Around mid-morning, a young woman appeared at the entrance, walking slowly, her frame so thin that the disproportion between her height and body mass was immediately noticeable, her shoulders slumped, as if bearing an invisible weight, and her vacant eyes scanning the surroundings with clear wariness. She arrived alone, without any companion, no vehicle, no bag, luggage or identification papers, and had to pause for quite a while before gathering enough strength to step over the threshold into the clinic. From the very first moment of contact, the on-duty staff noticed that her physical condition was unlike typical exhaustion cases. Her skin was pale and dry, lips cracked, hair brittle and unkempt, nails brittle and shrunken muscles all pointed to signs of prolonged malnutrition and neglect, not the aftermath of a short-term incident. Once brought into the intake area, initial vital signs showed her body in a state of alarm, with unstable heart rate, low blood pressure, and severe dehydration symptoms, forcing medical staff to prioritize stabilization measures before proceeding with any administrative procedures. Psychologically, her responses were slow and fragmented. She took several seconds to process simple questions, answered with short words, did not volunteer information, and frequently hesitated, as though each utterance required careful consideration. Her gaze rarely held direct eye contact, her movements carried a defensive quality, and her concentration was easily disrupted, leading medical staff to assess that she was in a state of clear psychological instability, likely tied to prolonged stress or unprocessed trauma. Throughout the intake process, one detail stood out and drew everyone's attention: the only item she carried, a single old metal key, gripped tightly in her hand, from the moment she entered until staff asked to temporarily set it aside for medical examination convenience. The key had a worn and scratched surface, no keychain attached, no identifying marks, and could not immediately be linked to any specific lock type, but her reaction when releasing it showed it was not an ordinary inanimate object. It was the one thing she had chosen to keep with her. The key was carefully documented in the intake record as her sole personal item upon arrival, and was stored separately to prevent loss. As first aid measures were implemented, medical staff quickly realized that this level of emaciation could not have developed in just weeks or months. The physical signs indicated a prolonged process of malnutrition, lack of medical care, and restricted movement, raising questions about her living circumstances over the intervening period, though those questions could not yet be asked directly. Following protocol for handling cases with unusual signs and incomplete identification, the clinic contacted local authorities to report the appearance of a young woman in severe emaciated condition, while providing initial details on appearance, estimated age, and psychological responses. When law enforcement arrived, they received the report from medical staff and began cross-referencing identifying features with existing databases, noting a significant match with the file of a high school girl reported missing nearly 2 years earlier, a detail that elevated the entire handling process to a higher level of caution, while still keeping medical priorities foremost. There was no media presence, no crowd of onlookers, or any public announcement at this time, as all involved parties agreed that the absolute priority was ensuring the girl's immediate safety and health stabilization. Charlotte Nolan was transferred to an ambulance under continuous medical supervision for transport to a larger medical facility in the area, where sufficient equipment and personnel were available for in-depth testing, long-term monitoring, and comprehensive physical and psychological evaluation. The metal key, along with the few other items on her person, was temporarily sealed according to procedure to ensure nothing was lost and everything remained intact. Charlotte's sudden reappearance at the remote clinic on the edge of Sedona, in a state of evident physical exhaustion, psychological instability, and carrying only a single metal key of unknown origin, brought an end to nearly 2 years of prolonged absence with a concrete and tangible presence, compelling the healthcare system and authorities to shift from passively monitoring a cold case to directly responding to a person teetering on the fragile edge between collapse and safety, while all questions about the time that had passed, the places and circumstances she had endured, were temporarily set aside to make way for the most urgent task, keeping Charlotte Nolan alive and stable. After Charlotte was transferred to a larger medical facility for continued monitoring and treatment, authorities coordinated with the medical team to initiate the identity confirmation process in accordance with standards for a long-term missing person case, in a context where all evaluations had to be conducted with extreme caution to avoid errors and ensure the legal rights of the individual being received. Since Charlotte had no identification documents with her and her physical and psychological condition did not yet allow for detailed interviewing, the first step focused on collecting basic biometric data, including fingerprints, facial features, height, bone structure, and other identifying markers previously recorded in her school and prior medical records. This data was cross-referenced with Arizona state databases and national missing persons records to determine the degree of match before proceeding to deeper verification steps. In parallel, doctors reviewed Charlotte's old medical records, including past examinations, vaccinations, and biological characteristics documented during her high school years, thereby providing additional basis for comparison with her current indicators. During this phase, Charlotte remained under continuous medical monitoring. Invasive tests were minimized as much as possible to avoid adding further stress to her already emaciated body, and every procedure was explained briefly and clearly, in line with her still unstable psychological state. When initial biometric comparison results showed a high match with the file of Charlotte Nolan reported missing 2 years earlier, authorities decided to proceed with the decisive confirmation step, DNA comparison, a standard measure in cases requiring absolute identity verification. Biological samples were collected according to medical protocol, under the supervision of medical staff and investigative agency representatives, then sent to a designated laboratory for comparison with DNA samples stored from the family during the initial investigation phase. This process took several days, during which Charlotte continued to receive treatment and physical stabilization, while being subjected to no interrogation pressure beyond her capacity to endure. When the DNA analysis results were returned, the match was confirmed at an absolute level, officially establishing that the girl who appeared at the remote clinic on the edge of Sedona was Charlotte Nolan, the individual reported missing in 2016, and at the time of confirmation, she had turned 18 years old. The identity confirmation was documented in a legal record, signed by representatives of the investigative agency and the medical facility, marking the end of the doubt phase and opening a new legal status for the case. Immediately after identity confirmation, authorities followed the protocol for particularly sensitive cases to notify the family, ensuring the information was conveyed directly, with necessary psychological support in place, and no leaks to the outside before the family was informed. This notification was carried out by a police representative along with victim support staff, with the dual goal of providing verified information and preparing the family to confront the reality that Charlotte had returned in a condition far different from what they had imagined during 2 years of waiting. The family's reaction was recorded as a complex mix of relief, emotion, and profound anxiety, reflecting the psychological impact of a long-term missing loved one, suddenly reappearing in a state of severe emaciation, administratively and investigationally. Confirming that Charlotte Nolan was alive and had been located compelled authorities to make the official decision to reopen the entire case file, shifting its status from a passively monitored cold case to an active ongoing investigation with entirely new facts. This decision was documented in writing, citing the legal basis as the reappearance of the previously missing person and confirmation of identity via DNA, while reactivating the specialized units that had participated in the early handling of the case. At the conclusion of the identity confirmation phase, Charlotte Nolan's file was no longer regarded simply as a missing person case of unknown cause, but became a matter requiring comprehensive re-examination in light of the new data, while all subsequent activities had to be carried out in parallel with ensuring her safety, privacy, and the process of physical as well as mental recovery for Charlotte, who was now no longer just a name in a file, but a person who had returned after 2 years of vanishing from community life. After Charlotte Nolan's identity was officially confirmed, and her initial condition had been stabilized to a permissible level, the medical team at the treatment facility conducted a comprehensive physical evaluation to determine the extent of damage her body had endured during the nearly 2-year period of disappearance, while simultaneously building a detailed medical record that would serve both treatment objectives and investigative requirements. The first focus of the evaluation process was on the state of malnutrition and dehydration, 2 factors that had been identified immediately upon Charlotte's appearance at the remote clinic on the edge of town. Blood tests and biochemical markers revealed electrolyte imbalance, significantly depleted energy reserves compared to the normal physiological standard for a young woman of her age, along with evidence of prolonged deficiency in several essential micronutrients, reflecting inadequate and unstable nutritional intake over an extended period. Doctors concluded that this condition was not the result of short-term fasting or a temporary crisis phase, but rather the outcome of a systematic, long-lasting process of malnutrition severe enough to affect muscle structure, bone density, and the body's overall recovery capacity. In parallel with the nutritional assessment, the medical team clearly documented signs indicating that Charlotte had been deprived of natural sunlight exposure for a prolonged time, evidenced by abnormally pale skin, low vitamin D levels, and physiological changes typically seen in individuals living in enclosed or sunlight-deficient environments. Motor function tests also revealed a marked decline in muscle strength and joint flexibility, consistent with a lifestyle of prolonged movement restriction, in which the body was not used adequately in daily activities. Notably, during the clinical examination and diagnostic imaging, doctors found no acute injuries typically associated with accidents, serious falls or rescue attempts, nor did they record any fresh fractures, soft tissue trauma, or internal organ damage from a sudden violent event. The absence of accident-related injuries, or high physical effort escape injuries, helped rule out the possibility that Charlotte had just undergone an emergency rescue situation, or moved under dangerous conditions immediately before reappearing, while also providing an important reference point for reconstructing the circumstances of her life during the time she was missing. Based on the synthesis of clinical data, laboratory results, and direct observations, medical specialists carried out a preliminary assessment of the possible duration and conditions of confinement Charlotte may have experienced, not to reach legal conclusions, but to provide a medical reference framework for the investigating authorities. The signs of prolonged malnutrition, lack of light exposure, restricted movement, and the absence of accident-related injuries suggested that she had been in a relatively fixed, enclosed and controlled environment, where minimum living needs were met at a very low level, but without adequate medical intervention or full care. This assessment was not based on isolated speculation, but was the result of comparing her current bodily indicators with her prior medical data, allowing doctors to estimate the length of time her body had to adapt to such deprived conditions. The entire set of examination results was compiled into a detailed medical record that included descriptions of physical condition, laboratory values, diagnostic images, and specialist opinions, with the dual purpose of developing a long-term treatment plan for Charlotte and providing reliable reference material for the reopened investigation. This record was stored under strict confidentiality regulations and shared only with authorized relevant parties to ensure that all information concerning Charlotte's health status was used for proper purposes and did not cause additional psychological harm to her. At the conclusion of the initial physical evaluation phase, the doctors reached a consensus that Charlotte's body was in a fragile recovery stage that required continuous and controlled medical care, while at the same time, the data collected had provided an important foundation for gaining a clearer understanding of the conditions she had endured during her disappearance, thereby assisting law enforcement in reconstructing the sequence of events based on specific medical evidence rather than emotional speculation, all while the top priority remained protecting Charlotte Nolan's health and long-term safety. After Charlotte Nolan's physical condition had been stabilized to a permissible level and the initial medical record had been completed, the assigned team of psychologists and psychiatrists conducted a comprehensive evaluation of her mental state, with the goal of determining the extent of psychological trauma, her current cognitive capacity, and her level of readiness for investigative interactions. The evaluation process was implemented cautiously, taking place in a lightly controlled environment, free of pressure, and in close coordination with the medical team to avoid unnecessarily triggering stress responses. Basic cognitive tests showed that Charlotte still maintained foundational orientation to time, place, and self. However, her information processing speed was significantly slower than the norm for a young woman of her age, particularly in situations requiring short-term memory recall or quick responses. Her verbal communication ability existed, but was limited, with a tendency toward short answers, avoidance of extended expression, and frequent mid-sentence pauses, as though weighing the safety of each word, a characteristic noted by experts as a sign of self-censorship, developed in a prolonged controlled environment. When delving deeper into emotional state assessment, psychologists identified clear manifestations of complex PTSD, not tied to a single event, but to a prolonged series of experiences under conditions of strict autonomy. These manifestations included persistently elevated hypervigilance, startle responses to unexpected sounds, difficulty maintaining eye contact, and pervasive anxiety, even in non-threatening situations. Notably, Charlotte displayed pronounced dissociation tendencies, with moments of emotional detachment from the present experience, blank stares, and delayed responses, as though she temporarily withdrew from her surroundings as a self-protective mechanism against psychological stimuli. This state was not constant, but recurred repeatedly when conversation topics inadvertently touched on feelings of control, spatial confinement, or loss of choice, indicating a strong link between psychological triggers and experiences during her disappearance. In addition, experts documented a systematic pattern of avoidance, not only toward direct questions, but also toward situations requiring her to express personal opinions or individual desires, a behavior commonly observed in individuals accustomed to having all decisions imposed by others. In a clearly structured environment, with hierarchical authority, Charlotte exhibited near-automatic submissive reflexes, complying with instructions silently and rarely asking questions, even in situations where refusal or adjustment was entirely legal and safe. This reflex was assessed not as active cooperation, but as an adaptive mechanism formed to minimize conflict and risk in a formerly strictly controlled environment. Based on the synthesis of clinical observations, standardized testing, and real-time interactions, the psychological team concluded that Charlotte was currently not in a suitable state to participate in detailed questioning sessions, particularly prolonged or confrontational interviews. Her ability to recount events existed, but was fragmented, easily interrupted by dissociation and avoidance responses, making the collection of detailed information at this stage carry a risk of re-traumatization and memory distortion. The experts recommended that any investigative interactions proceed in short, incremental steps, with the presence or supervision of a psychological specialist, and focus only on the minimum necessary information in the initial phase. This psychological evaluation was compiled into an official report, clearly stating Charlotte's current limitations in cognitive capacity, communication, and psychological stress tolerance, while providing specific guidelines for authorities on appropriate approaches to protect her mental health. At the conclusion of the evaluation phase, the overall consensus was that Charlotte Nolan still retained the foundational cognitive capacity needed to gradually participate in clarifying the facts, but only under tightly controlled psychological conditions, with the absolute priority being mental recovery and stabilization before any detailed statement requests were made, ensuring that the pursuit of truth did not become a new source of harm for someone who had just returned after a long period of living in a state of deprived autonomy. When the psychological experts determined that Charlotte Nolan had reached the minimum level of stability, allowing for the partial recording of statements, the process was implemented slowly, under controlled conditions, and focused on reconstructing the initial grooming phase, avoiding any confrontational elements or pressure that could distort memories. It was within this framework that Charlotte began describing the moment Elliot Pike re-entered her life, while she was still 16 years old, not as a stranger or a threat, but in the role of someone who had once belonged to the extended family structure. According to her account, Elliot Pike was her mother's ex-husband, who had left the family some time before her disappearance, but still maintained an indirect presence through social connections and occasional contacts considered unremarkable in the context of a restructured family after divorce. Charlotte described that Elliot's initial approach carried no elements of violence, coercion, or threat. On the contrary, it took the form of selective concern, short suggestive conversations, and offers of help presented as the reasonable caring of an adult who had once held family responsibility. During this phase, Elliot leveraged his familiar status to create a sense of safety, often recalling old family memories, emphasizing his role as someone who truly understood Charlotte's circumstances, and appearing ready to listen to things she found difficult to share with her mother or friends. Charlotte stated that at that time, she did not perceive any boundaries being crossed, because all interactions stayed within the framework she had long been accustomed to, with no suddenness or behavior that would put her on guard. The experts noted that the key element in this account was that Elliot did not approach Charlotte as an unfamiliar target, but as a continuation of an existing family structure, allowing him to bypass the natural protective barriers that a 16-year-old girl typically has toward outsiders. Charlotte described the grooming process as occurring in small incremental steps, beginning with encouraging her to share everyday difficulties, then gradually offering directive evaluations that made her believe only he truly understood and could help her escape the feeling of being trapped in her familiar environment. The initial offers involved harmless activities, such as short outings or invitations to meet to talk more comfortably, presented as opportunities for Charlotte to have private space away from the pressures she felt at home and school. According to her account, it was precisely the familiarity and continuity of these interactions that prevented Charlotte from realizing the moment when her personal control began to erode. Small decisions gradually came to be based on implicit agreement with Elliot, rather than on her independent desires. Charlotte described how her sense of personal choice became blurred as Elliot repeatedly reaffirmed that he knew what was best for her, and that those around her could not or would not understand her the way he did. The process of separating Charlotte from her familiar environment did not occur through a single event, but through a series of small shifts in habits and spheres of contact, in which she increasingly relied on Elliot to determine what was safe, what should be avoided, and when to stay silent. The psychologists assessed that this account reflects a model of approach based on deliberate trust building, where violence was not the initial tool, but rather the restructuring of the victim's perception of the relationship and autonomy. Charlotte stated that at a certain point, she realized she was no longer making decisions independently, but by then the sense of dependency had become deep enough to make resistance difficult to imagine, let alone carry out. The statement in this phase was recorded as a continuous sequence of descriptions, uninterrupted by details of violence or direct confrontation, yet clearly showing the beginning of the loss of personal control through the gradual shift of decision-making power from the victim to the groomer. The investigative team and psychologists agreed that this content should be handled as evidence of the method of approach in grooming, not as a confession of subsequent acts, and therefore the recording was conducted carefully, focusing on sequence and context, rather than traumatizing details. Throughout this process, Charlotte displayed clear signs of psychological fatigue, but still maintained the ability to recount the sequence of events chronologically, allowing the experts to determine that her account of the grooming phase carried high reliability within the current assessment framework. This portion of the statement concluded at the point where Charlotte identified that she had crossed the invisible boundary between autonomy and control, boundary not marked by immediate violence, but by the gradual acceptance of decisions that no longer belonged to her, creating an important perceptual foundation for understanding how a seemingly familiar relationship could be used to lead and deprive a 16-year-old girl of personal freedom, without needing overt coercion from the start. According to the statement recorded under tightly controlled psychological conditions, after the grooming process was complete, and Charlotte gradually lost initiative in her personal decision, a systematic confinement procedure began to be established, with the focus on bringing her to a fixed location outside residential areas, completely isolated from familiar routines, and with no regular community presence. Charlotte described this location as an enclosed space with little variation, chosen not for comfort, but for its ability to maintain absolute control and minimize the risk of outside attention, where every element of the environment served to restrict freedom of movement and contact. The confinement was not carried out through overt coercive measures or constant restraints, but through the establishment of clear spatial boundaries, making Charlotte understand that she was not permitted to leave a designated area and had no realistic option to do otherwise. Her freedom of movement was strictly controlled, not only through direct supervision, but also through consistently maintained implicit rules, where compliance became the condition for avoiding consequences that did not need to be verbalized. Charlotte stated that from the beginning, all forms of contact with others were eliminated, no visitors, no social interactions, and no opportunity whatsoever for her to reach anyone outside the confinement space, creating a state of near-total social isolation. Means of communication with the outside world were completely severed, including phone, internet, and all forms of information exchange, but this did not occur as a sudden act of deprivation, rather it was gradually normalized, leading Charlotte to accept that contact was no longer within her capability or right. According to her account, this severance caused the concept of the outside world to fade over time, with no new information, no social rhythms to reference, and all frames of reality gradually narrowing to the confines of the detention space. In that environment, a rigidly repeating daily schedule was established and maintained, with fixed times for eating, resting, and the minimal permitted activities, creating a monotonous and predictable rhythm of life, where each day passed with almost no significant difference from the previous one. Charlotte described how this repetition gradually eroded her sense of time, causing days to blend together, and the ability to pinpoint temporal markers to become vague, making waiting or hoping for change difficult to conceive. The imposition of the schedule served not only to manage behavior, but also as a psychological control tool, where any deviation from the pattern could lead to instability, or a sense of danger, forcing Charlotte to self-adjust to fit the imposed order. Prolonged social isolation was reinforced by minimizing external stimuli to the greatest extent, no changing scenery, no social sounds, and none of the random interactions that typically help people maintain a sense of self within a community, causing Charlotte's world to gradually shrink to only the elements within the controlled space. According to her account, in those conditions, her previous social relationships gradually became distant and abstract, while the presence of the controller became the sole reference point for every decision and feeling of safety. Charlotte stated that over time, she began to internalize the confinement rules, self-limiting her own behavior, even without direct supervision, a reflexive adaptation formed from long-term living in a controlled environment. The psychologists assessed that this description reflects a highly organized confinement process, in which a fixed space, movement control, communication cutoff, and repeating schedule were used simultaneously to maintain isolation and dependency, without the need for continuously high levels of violence. Charlotte did not describe this process as a series of discrete events, but as a prolonged state in which personal freedom was eroded bit by bit through habit, repetition, and the absence of alternative choices. Prolonged social isolation, according to the account, not only stripped away the ability to connect with others, but also gradually diminished her sense of personal identity, as all previous social roles ceased to be reinforced or reflected. The portion of the statement concerning the establishment of the confinement procedure was recorded as a structural description of how a separated, stable, and tightly controlled environment could be used to sustain the deprivation of freedom over an extended period, consistent with the physical and psychological signs documented upon Charlotte's return, and providing an important foundation for understanding the mechanism of prolonged social isolation she endured throughout her time in captivity. In the process of compiling Charlotte's partial statements and cross-referencing them with collected background data, investigators determined that Elliot Pike's criminal motive did not arise from a sudden violent impulse, but was the result of a prolonged chain of perceptions and personal conflicts originating from his discovery that Charlotte was not his biological daughter during his prior marriage to her mother. According to reviewed documents, this information emerged in the context of a severely fractured marital relationship where suspicion and feelings of betrayal gradually accumulated before leading to divorce, creating a psychological foundation particularly prone to transforming into obsessive resentment. Investigators noted that discovering Charlotte was not his biological child was not only a personal shock, but was also interpreted by Elliot as evidence of prolonged betrayal, causing him to restructure his entire marital memories in a way that self-justified his sense of insult and loss of control. In that interpretation, The mother became the direct target of anger, but Charlotte, as the tangible symbol of the hidden truth, became the channel through which Elliot carried out indirect revenge that carried lower legal risk but greater psychological satisfaction. Rather than confronting openly or causing immediate harm, Elliot chose a prolonged path where maintaining confinement became a method of continuous control and punishment, allowing him to experience sustained power in the face of the helplessness he believed he had endured in the marriage. Behavioral analysis showed that this motive was not aimed at quickly destroying the target, but at creating a state of long-term dependency and deprivation, where the victim was forced to exist within the framework established by the controller, thereby extending the feeling of victory and reaffirming personal power. Experts assessed that the choice to maintain confinement, rather than cause immediate harm, reflected a sophisticated revenge pattern, in which Charlotte's life was preserved not out of compassion, but because it directly served the goal of prolonged control and punishment, while also minimizing the risk of detection compared to overt violent acts. Elliot, according to the evaluations, rationalized his behavior by detaching moral responsibility from the specific target, viewing Charlotte not as an independent individual with her own rights, but as an extension of the collapsed marital relationship, thereby allowing him to maintain confinement as an unresolved settlement of his personal conflict. This motive also explains why the initial grooming phase was designed around trust and a familial role, because Elliot needed a low-profile pathway to bring Charlotte into his sphere of control without triggering social resistance or early intervention by authorities. Once a stable confinement environment had been established, prolonging the duration became an end in itself, not only to avoid risk, but also to sustain a continuous sense of control, an element that psychologists viewed as central to the criminal motive in this case. The collected data showed no indication of a plan for immediate harm from the outset. On the contrary, every action was directed toward building and maintaining a sustainable order of control, where the victim was isolated from the outside world and forced to adapt to rules set by the controller. In the overall picture, Elliot's motive was identified as a combination of feelings of betrayal, the need to reaffirm personal power, and the choice of indirect revenge through a target with little capacity for resistance, rather than seeking resolution through legal or social channels. Maintaining long-term confinement, therefore, was not an incidental consequence of circumstances, but a core component of the criminal motive, allowing the perpetrator to extend the state of control and punishment in silence, while concealing the behavior under the guise of familial familiarity and geographic distance, creating a crime pattern that was difficult to detect in its early stages, and could only be clarified when disparate facts were placed together in the full context of marital conflict, betrayal, and a prolonged form of revenge. According to the partial statements recorded and cross-referenced with medical evaluations, the confinement space where Charlotte was held for an extended period was described as a simply structured room deliberately designed to serve long-term control, without drawing outside attention, and without creating easily detectable signs in the surrounding area. This room was located in a detached structure, not part of a densely populated residential area, with an area small enough to restrict movement, but sufficient to sustain minimal existence over a long time, and organized in a way that eliminated every unnecessary element. Charlotte described the surfaces in the room as primarily hard materials with few details, difficult to produce loud echoes, indicating the purpose of minimizing noise escaping to the surrounding space, while blurring the boundary between day and night through strict light control. Soundproofing elements were not achieved with modern specialized equipment, but through the choice of location and materials, sufficient to prevent normal living sounds from carrying beyond the room's boundaries, creating a sense of isolation, even without direct coercive measures. Light in the confinement space was completely controlled, with no windows opening to the outside, or only an indirect light source that did not allow observation of the surrounding environment, making it impossible for Charlotte to determine the time of day based on natural light. The turning on and off of lights was not under her control, but depended on a schedule set from outside, causing the concept of time to become vague and reliant on artificial cues. According to her account, this light control had a direct impact on her perception of time, causing days to pass without clear markers and contributing to the erosion of orientation ability and the maintenance of a sense of life progression. The centerpiece of the spatial control mechanism was the door and the lock attached to it, where the metal key played a pivotal role in maintaining the boundary between freedom and captivity. Charlotte confirmed that the single key she held upon reappearing was the one associated with that door, not because she was permitted to use it freely, but because seeing and being aware of its existence became part of the psychological control mechanism, constantly reminding her that all entry and exit depended on the person holding power. The key's role was not merely physical, but also symbolic, representing absolute decision-making authority over space and time that she did not possess, and its appearance with her upon return reflected the depth of psychological attachment between this object and the experience of confinement. Living conditions in this space were maintained at a minimal level, enough to ensure survival, but providing no comfort or personal choice, with basic needs such as eating, hygiene, and rest met according to a fixed and flexible schedule that allowed no adjustment based on personal wishes. Charlotte described how the absence of even the smallest choices turned every daily activity into an obligation rather than an act of autonomy, reinforcing prolonged feelings of dependency and loss of control. The confinement space was neither decorated nor personalized, containing no personal items, causing her personal identity to gradually detach from her living environment, and all traces of her previous life to fade over time. Psychologists assessed that such a spatial structure, combined with control over light, sound and access through the key, created an ideal environment for sustaining long-term control without the need for continuous violence. According to the account, it was precisely the cold stability of this space, where every element was predictable but unchangeable, that contributed to forming the submissive reflexes and dissociation states documented in the psychological evaluations after Charlotte's return. The confinement space, therefore, was not merely a physical location, but a comprehensive control tool, where the room's structure, soundproofing, lighting, time management, and the key's role worked together to maintain social isolation and deprive personal freedom over an extended period, consistent with the established medical and psychological data, and providing the necessary spatial context to fully understand the minimal living conditions Charlotte had to adapt to throughout her captivity. In the course of a comprehensive review of the nearly 2-year period during which Charlotte Nolan disappeared from community life, investigators conducted an analysis of traces of existence outside the system of statements and medical records in order to determine whether there was any independent activity by her during that time, and the results showed an almost absolute void in data. First, there were no personal financial records in Charlotte's name throughout this period. No bank transactions, no new accounts opened, no purchases, withdrawals, or electronic payments. An especially noteworthy fact in a society where even small transactions typically leave a trace. The complete absence of financial data indicates that Charlotte had no access to cash or payment instruments and did not participate in any recordable economic activity, reinforcing the conclusion that all her basic living needs were controlled and provided at a minimal level by another party. In parallel, authorities confirmed there was no evidence whatsoever that Charlotte used any communication devices during the period of her disappearance, including mobile phones, personal computers, email accounts, social media, or online messaging platforms. All previously existing accounts showed no login activity, generated no new data, and recorded no attempts to access them from various locations. The lack of communication device usage not only reflects the severance of social connections, but also rules out the possibility that Charlotte was freely moving about or seeking help during this time, since even individuals living in hiding usually leave at least minimal digital traces. Another notable point in this 2-year gap is the complete absence of external medical records outside the current care system. No hospital admissions, doctor visits, prescription purchases, or use of medical services were recorded under Charlotte's name or any equivalent identifying information. For someone transitioning from adolescence to young adulthood, having no medical contact whatsoever over such an extended period is extremely rare unless all health issues were ignored or handled completely outside the official system, something consistent with the signs of malnutrition and lack of medical care documented upon her return. Additionally, investigators found no evidence of any social interactions by Charlotte during this period. No independent witnesses, no records from educational institutions, workplaces, religious organizations, or community groups, and no one reported having seen or come into contact with her in any public setting. This absence not only reflects her separation from society, but also demonstrates a level of control tight enough to prevent even the possibility of random contact with outsiders, a level of restriction that rarely occurs, even in cases of lesser degrees of freedom deprivation. When synthesizing all of these elements, investigators concluded that the 2-year gap was not the result of Charlotte living as a drifter, in hiding, or voluntarily withdrawing from society, because those scenarios almost always leave scattered traces in financial, medical, or social records. Instead, the simultaneous absence of every type of data points to a state of comprehensive control in which every aspect of personal life, from movement, communication, and health care to social interaction, was either fully managed or completely eliminated. This assessment is strengthened by the consistency between the data void and Charlotte's descriptions of the confinement space, the repeating daily schedule, and the complete severance of communication as presented in her statements, forming a coherent picture of a closed-off period of existence that left no trace to the outside world. Analytical experts assessed that this level of control could not have been maintained through passive supervision alone, but required an active structure designed to block all unauthorized contact, from restricting communication means to achieving geographic and social isolation. The 2-year gap, therefore, is not merely a period without information, but a crucial indicator reflecting the thoroughness of the deprivation of autonomy, in which Charlotte was forced to exist outside every conventional record-keeping system of modern society. Identifying and analyzing this gap plays a pivotal role in evaluating the nature of the criminal conduct, because it demonstrates not only physical confinement, but also the deliberate erasure of every sign of the victim's independent existence over a prolonged period, consistent with the pattern of comprehensive control established through medical, psychological, and testimonial evidence, and providing an essential basis for fully understanding the degree and scope of the control that Charlotte Nolan was subjected to throughout the time she was separated from the outside world. According to the statement recorded after Charlotte Nolan reached a psychological state that allowed reconstruction of prolonged perceptual processes, the escape preparation process did not begin with a sudden decision, but formed gradually in the context of comprehensive control, where any impulsive action equated to the risk of detection and punishment. Charlotte described that the initial phase of this process did not take the form of specific planning, but rather passive observation of the controller's habits and daily routines. An activity carried out silently over a long period, without revealing any signs of resistance. She began paying attention to fixed points in the daily rhythm, including times of appearance, times of absence, repeating intervals in the eating schedule, checks, and small but consistent cyclical changes, from which she gradually formed an unofficial mental map of the level of supervision. This observation was not aimed at seeking an immediate opportunity, but at understanding the safety boundaries of each small action, helping her adjust her behavior so as not to cross the threshold of attention. In parallel with recording habits, Charlotte began systematically memorizing the confinement space, not only at the level of the room structure, but also in the relationships between elements, such as the door, the lock, light sources, sounds, and blind spots in the line of sight. She described this process as building a mental diagram, where every small detail was stored in memory, without the need for notes or physical traces, because any unusual object could become a cause for suspicion. The locking mechanism received special attention from Charlotte, not through direct testing, but by observing the repeated sequence of operations and the characteristic sounds of each step, allowing her to distinguish different lock states and recognize when the door was truly under tight control or merely maintained at a minimal preventive level. Throughout this process, Charlotte emphasized that controlling psychological reactions played a pivotal role, because any change in behavior, eye expression, or daily rhythm could be interpreted as an abnormal sign. She described having to maintain a prolonged neutral emotional state, minimizing spontaneous reactions and learning to conceal inner fluctuations to avoid drawing unwanted attention. Psychologists assessed that this was not indifference, but a survival strategy, where emotional regulation became a tool for self-protection in a continuously monitored environment. According to the account, Charlotte did not set a specific time for escape in the initial phase, because the idea was seen as too risky, without sufficient data on space, time, and control mechanisms. Instead, she chose to accumulate information over a long period, accepting slowness as part of the plan, because any hasty attempt could make the confinement conditions stricter. Escape planning, therefore, occurred more at the cognitive level than in action, with the focus on keeping herself undetected while small pieces were gradually pieced together over time. Charlotte described having to continuously balance maintaining an outward appearance of compliance with preserving a separate mental space, where the idea of escape could exist without being outwardly expressed. The prolonged nature of the preparation process did not weaken her determination. On the contrary, it helped strengthen her endurance and patience, essential factors for waiting for suitable conditions without putting herself in danger. Analytical experts assessed that this account reflects a non-traditional planning process, where the absence of physical tools forced the victim to rely entirely on memory, observation, and psychological adjustment to build escape capability. Charlotte did not describe her plan as a rigid sequence of steps, but as a prolonged state of readiness, where all accumulated information prepared for an undetermined moment that was expected to converge sufficient safe conditions. This portion of the statement shows that the escape preparation process was not a desperate reaction to circumstances, but a long-term strategy formed in a tightly controlled environment, where patience, observational ability, and control over psychological reactions became the only resources allowing Charlotte to maintain hope and the capacity for action in conditions where all other choices had been stripped away. According to the statement recorded after Charlotte Nolan was capable of reconstructing a continuous sequence of events, the moment of executing the escape plan was not tied to a dramatic incident or an unexpected lapse, but emerged as the result of prolonged accumulated observation, when conditions regarding space, time, and psychological state converged at the lowest acceptable level of risk for her. Charlotte described that the decision to act was made during a period when the familiar daily rhythm showed no deviations, no signs of heightened alertness, and supervisory presence at its minimum, according to the patterns she had memorized over a long time. The approach to the key did not involve snatching it or direct confrontation, but occurred through a sequence of operations she had cognitively prepared for, where every movement was tightly controlled to avoid creating unusual sounds or rhythms. Charlotte described the sensation of holding the key as a state of both detachment and extreme focus, where she had to keep her physical reactions from reflecting inner tension in order to avoid any detectable signals. The use of the key followed exactly the sequence she had memorized: no testing, no hesitation, because any mistake could prevent the door from opening or create an abnormal sign. When the lock shifted state, Charlotte did not describe a feeling of triumph, but absolute concentration on the next step, reflecting how she had learned to delay emotions in favor of safety. When the door was opened, leaving the confinement space did not happen quickly or chaotically, but as a cautious, step-by-step process of checking the surrounding environment to confirm there was no presence or change compared to what she had previously observed. Charlotte stated that the moment of stepping across the threshold did not bring immediate liberation, because her mind remained in a state of high alertness, where every sound and movement was evaluated as a potential threat. The movement out of the confinement space was carried out in the direction she had previously determined through spatial memory, avoiding areas likely to cause noise or require stopping, and the goal was not the fastest route, but the safest one. Charlotte described that upon leaving the isolated area, the sense of open space did not bring instant relief, because her body had not yet adjusted to no longer being confined by nearby surfaces, and the reflex of behavioral control still dominated every movement. The continued movement occurred in a state of energy conservation because her physical condition did not allow prolonged strenuous effort. Steps were adjusted to avoid exhaustion, and every decision was based on the ability to maintain steady progress rather than speed. Charlotte described her physical state upon escaping outside as a combination of emaciation and heightened alertness, where the body was weakened but perception operated more intensely to compensate for physical limitations. Signs of dehydration, dizziness, and aches appeared during the movement, but were not enough to make her stop, because she had become accustomed to regulating bodily reactions under prolonged deprivation. When moving farther from the isolated area, Charlotte did not immediately seek help, did not approach crowded places or obvious resources, but continued moving according to the principle of avoiding attention, reflecting how survival reflexes formed during confinement still governed her behavior, even when direct risk had decreased. According to psychological experts, this account shows that the escape was not an impulsive emotional act, but the result of a tightly controlled chain of decisions, where using the key was merely one link in the process of leaving the confinement space that had been cognitively prepared for a very long time. Charlotte described that only when the distance from the isolated area was sufficient and familiar signs of control were no longer present, did her body begin to react with clear fatigue, forcing her to adjust her pace and seek safe stopping points. A state reflecting the fragile boundary between prolonged endurance and accumulated exhaustion. The portion of the statement concerning the escape was recorded as a highly controlled sequence of actions, where every movement, every manipulation of the key, and every physical reaction reflected the combination of long-term preparation and self-regulation under risk conditions, showing that leaving the confinement space was not random luck, but the outcome of an extended process of adaptation and planning within a comprehensively controlled environment. After Charlotte Nolan's statements reached a level of detail and consistency sufficient to serve as an operational basis, the investigative agency officially initiated the crime scene tracing process with a cautious approach, treating all obtained information as guiding data requiring independent verification rather than preconceived conclusions. The initial focus was on systematizing Charlotte's statements according to spatial and temporal sequence, separating subjective perceptual elements from details with potential physical verifiability, such as distances traveled, directions taken, environmental characteristics, and fixed landmarks she could recall after prolonged isolation. The investigative team worked closely with psychological experts to ensure that the information extraction process did not cause re-traumatization, while employing cognitive interviewing techniques to help Charlotte recreate the space through sensations, habits, and repetition, rather than demanding direct descriptions that carried pressure. In parallel with processing the statements, the metal key that Charlotte carried upon reappearance was submitted for analysis as a central piece of physical evidence, since it was the only tangible link between her and the confinement space. Forensic experts conducted measurements, detailed photography, analysis of wear patterns, tooth configuration, and usage marks to determine compatible lock types, while comparing it against common lock samples in rural and outlying areas. Preliminary results showed that the key did not belong to standard new residential construction types, but was consistent with auxiliary structures or renovated buildings, significantly narrowing the search scope. From the account of Charlotte's movement, after leaving the confinement space, the investigative team constructed search rings based on her physical capacity at the time of escape, factoring in elements such as terrain, slope, vegetation cover, and concealment potential to determine a reasonable radius she could have traveled before reaching populated areas. This data was overlaid with geographic maps, land use information, and records of isolated structures outside residential zones, thereby forming a list of suspect locations requiring field verification. The scoping process did not rely on a single clue, but on the intersection of statements, physical evidence, and environmental analysis to minimize the risk of overlooking or misidentifying targets. Once the suspect list was narrowed, reconnaissance teams approached each area in priority order, using discrete observation methods to avoid disturbing potential crime scenes or triggering reactions from related subjects. The approach was carried out incrementally, starting with remote verification of features matching Charlotte's description, such as degree of isolation, natural soundproofing potential, signs of light control, and the presence of auxiliary structures that could serve as confinement spaces. When a location met sufficient preliminary criteria, authorities obtained necessary legal warrants to conduct detailed inspections, ensuring all activities complied with procedure and preserved evidentiary value. During confirmation, the key was used as a direct comparison tool against existing locks under forensic expert supervision to determine compatibility without damaging or altering the current state. The key fitting a specific lock was regarded as a critical turning point, as it shifted the investigation from speculation to physical confirmation, allowing Charlotte's statements to be linked to a concrete real-world space. Concurrently, the technical team documented the site's current condition, including room structure, building materials, signs of light control, and minimal living conditions, for comparison with prior descriptions without requiring Charlotte to confront the scene directly. Samples were collected under strict protocol, prioritizing indicators of prolonged human presence under restricted conditions to reinforce the picture of a systematically maintained confinement space. The entire crime scene tracing process was conducted with the dual goal of objectively confirming the confinement location and minimizing psychological impact on Charlotte, who had provided the foundational information for the investigation. When the location was confirmed based on the alignment of statements, physical evidence, and spatial analysis, authorities officially recorded it as the crime scene directly related to the case, marking the transition from a reconstruction phase based on testimony to an investigation phase grounded in physical evidence. The crime scene tracing portion, therefore, was not merely a series of technical actions, but a process of connecting disparate fragments into a fixed point in space, where Charlotte's deprivation of freedom was placed in a specific context, creating a solid foundation for subsequent legal and investigative steps without relying on speculation or emotional interpretation. After the confinement location was legally confirmed and secured according to proper procedure, law enforcement conducted an examination of the detention site as a crime scene characterized by prolonged use, with the assumption that this was not a temporary space but a controlled living environment maintained long enough to accumulate lasting traces. The initial documentation focused on the overall spatial structure, including dimensions, building materials, degree of separation from the surrounding area, and accessibility, thereby establishing that this space had been chosen to minimize the chance of external detection and to maximally limit interference from social factors. During the detailed survey, investigators recorded numerous signs of repeated long-term habitation, evident in uneven floor wear, along certain fixed paths, wall surfaces, showing frequent contact at heights consistent with restricted postures, as well as areas continuously used for minimal rest, eating, and hygiene. These traces did not appear scattered or random, but were concentrated in specific locations, indicating a narrowed range of movement and forced activity confined to a limited space over an extended period. In parallel with documenting habitation traces, the examination team analyzed elements demonstrating behavioral and movement control, including the position of entry doors, locking systems, fixed bolts, and the internal layout designed to channel movement along controlled paths. This structure showed no flexibility in spatial choice. Every motion was either directed or blocked by physical barriers, making free movement impossible without access to the locking mechanism. Experts also noted the absence of elements allowing self-adjustment of the environment, such as control over natural light, ventilation, or sound, which contributed to maintaining a state of dependency and diminished perception of time, consistent with the previously recorded descriptions of a repeating daily schedule. During the evidence collection phase, forensic personnel classified and sealed items of probative value, including minimal living utensils, potential biological traces, surfaces capable of retaining prolonged contact marks, and components directly related to entry and exit control mechanisms. Each piece of evidence was documented with its location, condition, and relationship to the overall space to ensure chain of custody for legal proceedings and to prevent misinterpretation of intended use. The collection was not aimed at reconstructing detailed personal life, but at proving that this was a space systematically used to sustain the presence of an individual under severely restricted freedom. Forensic experts assessed that the simultaneous presence of long-term habitation traces and physical control mechanisms constituted strong evidence that the space was established and maintained for the purpose of detention rather than voluntary or temporary use. Based on the examination results, the investigative team evaluated the degree of unlawful confinement by comparing site features to legal criteria for deprivation of liberty, emphasizing the lack of free egress, absence of access to the outside world, and activity confined within a framework entirely controlled by another party. This evaluation was conducted using a synthesis of physical evidence, independent of statements alone, to ensure objectivity and resilience in legal proceedings. Investigators also examined the connection between the space's current condition and Charlotte's physical and psychological state upon return, noting clear compatibility between signs of limited movement, lack of light exposure, and submissive reflexes with what the scene displayed. The entire examination results were compiled into a detailed file, including technical descriptions, photographs, spatial diagrams, and evidence collection reports, to create a comprehensive evidentiary foundation for determining the nature of the detention conduct. Completing the examination of the confinement site not only confirmed the authenticity of prior statements, but also enabled authorities to conclude that this was a space used for unlawful long-term detention, with a level of control sufficient to comprehensively deprive personal freedom, thereby strengthening the legal basis for pursuing criminal liability against the individual responsible for establishing and maintaining this detention environment. Based on the synthesis of Charlotte Nolan's statements, crime scene examination results, and behavioral analysis, the investigative agency conducted an analysis of the criminal modus operandi as a deliberate sequence of actions designed to maintain long-term control rather than cause immediate harm, in which the key element was the exploitation of a familial relationship to gain access to and legitimize the perpetrator's presence in the victim's life. Elliot Pike did not approach Charlotte as a stranger, but in the role of a family member within the extended family structure, allowing him to bypass ordinary vigilance barriers and establish initial trust without resorting to coercion. Exploiting this position created a psychological foundation that made it difficult for Charlotte to recognize danger from the outset, while simultaneously weakening her capacity to resist as personal boundaries began to be gradually infringed. Rather than employing constant violence, the primary method identified was psychological control through environment, daily routine, and dependency, a technique that permitted sustained control with lower risk of detection. Investigators assessed that the restraint from violence did not stem from moral inhibition, but was a strategy to avoid leaving clear physical traces, reducing the likelihood of victim resistance or seeking help during any chance contact with the outside world. Psychological control was implemented through the establishment of implicit rules, where compliance was reinforced by the predictability of the environment and potential consequences, rather than overt punitive acts, causing the victim to gradually adjust her behavior to fit the imposed framework. The strategy for maintaining compliance was identified as an accumulative process in which repetition played a central role. A fixed daily schedule, unchanging space, and prolonged social isolation progressively diminished the ability to distinguish between personal choice and external command, turning submissive states into adaptive reflexes. Behavioral experts noted that maintaining an outward appearance of stability, without major violent incidents, served to erode resistance over time, as the victim became absorbed in daily survival, rather than sustaining awareness of her deprivation of freedom. Behavioral analysis showed that the perpetrator actively controlled information and stimuli, limiting access to external points of comparison to redefine reality in a manner favorable to control, a characteristic commonly seen in manipulative detention behaviors rather than crude coercion. Maintaining long-term confinement, rather than causing immediate harm, was viewed as a strategic choice to prolong indirect revenge, where depriving Charlotte of freedom and personal identity served as punishment directed at the mother, rather than seeking a quick resolution. The investigative agency assessed that this conduct reflected a high degree of premeditation, not an impulsive reaction to family conflict, but the outcome of a prolonged process of perception and decision-making, in which control elements were calculated to sustain long-term effectiveness and minimize legal risk. The combination of exploiting a familial relationship with psychological control enabled the perpetrator to operate a discrete, hard-to-detect crime pattern, in which the victim was isolated without leaving obvious traces of violence over an extended period. This analysis also indicated that the absence of constant violence did not equate to low danger level, but on the contrary, reflected a more sophisticated strategy where control was maintained through manipulation of perception and behavior, creating prolonged dependency and gradually eroding self-determination capacity. Overall, the criminal modus operandi was identified as a deliberate combination of approach based on familial ties, psychological control in place of violent coercion, and a strategy of sustaining compliance through isolation and repetition, forming a consistent behavioral model aligned with the goal of prolonged unlawful detention. This analysis provides a basis for understanding the nature of the criminal conduct, not only in terms of consequences, but also in its structure and operational motive, clarifying that the detention of Charlotte was not the result of random circumstances, but a calculated sequence of actions designed to maintain maximum control over an extended period without relying on frequent violence. After the entire chain of evidence was completed and cross-checked across multiple independent units, authorities reached the decision to designate Elliot Pike as the primary suspect with a sufficient degree of certainty to implement prosecutorial coercive measures, a decision not made impulsively but formed after a thorough assessment of risk, legality, and viability in court. This designation was based on the convergence of several key factors, including the direct familial relationship that allowed Pike to access Charlotte Nolan without initially arousing suspicion, the alignment between his personal schedule and critical periods of her disappearance, the compatibility between the described confinement space and locations over which Pike had actual control, along with details in Charlotte's statements that only someone with close familial ties and deep knowledge of family routines could have produced. Once investigators reached internal consensus on Pike's central role, the case file was transferred to the legal review phase to determine specific grounds for an arrest warrant, with particular emphasis on the severity of the alleged conduct, the ongoing risk to the victim, the potential for interference or evidence destruction, as well as the need to safeguard the expanding investigation. The arrest warrant was issued in accordance with proper authority, clearly listing charges related to prolonged unlawful detention, abuse of a familial relationship, and aggravating circumstances due to the victim being a minor at the time the offense began, thereby establishing a solid legal foundation for the temporary deprivation of the suspect's liberty. Prior to executing the arrest, law enforcement developed a detailed operational plan, including assessment of the approach environment, selection of an appropriate time to minimize confrontation risk, clear task assignments for each participating unit, and contingency measures for unforeseen situations, all aimed at ensuring the arrest proceeded safely, swiftly, and in full compliance with procedure. When the timing was determined, enforcement units approached Elliot Pike at his current residence, subdued and arrested him according to protocol without recording any significant resistance, indicating the suspect made no attempt to evade or endanger during the moment of control. Immediately after the arrest, Pike was fully informed of his legal rights, including the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, and the right to know the charges he faced, to ensure transparency and legality throughout the coercive process. The decision for pretrial detention was made after comprehensive consideration of relevant factors emphasizing the gravity of the alleged conduct, the extended duration of confinement, the severe impact on the victim, and the need to protect evidence integrity, leading to the conclusion that releasing the suspect at this stage posed unacceptable risks. During pretrial detention, investigators conducted initial questioning of Elliot Pike in accordance with standard procedure, beginning with confirmation of identity, personal history, family relationships, and activities during the period of Charlotte's disappearance, before delving into matters directly related to the confinement location and the alleged acts. Statements were recorded in the presence of legal representation as required, ensuring all collected information held prosecutorial value and did not violate human rights. Throughout this process, investigators employed controlled questioning methods, not aimed at forcing immediate admissions, but focused on comparing Pike's statements against already verified facts, thereby documenting points of consistency, as well as internal contradictions requiring clarification in subsequent sessions. Discrepancies between statements and physical evidence were compiled into a separate list to support the development of a long-term interrogation strategy and to strengthen the case file. The entire pretrial detention and initial statement collection process was closely supervised to prevent procedural errors that could undermine the case, reflecting the authorities' cautious approach in a highly complex and sensitive matter. The arrest of Elliot Pike not only marked the transition from verification to individual accountability, but also held significant importance in completely terminating the suspect's ability to exert control over or influence the victim and the investigative process. The arrest, pretrial detention, and initial statement collection were recorded as a pivotal procedural turning point, where the primary suspect was officially placed under the justice system's authority, enabling authorities to continue clarifying the full scope of the criminal conduct on the basis of objective evidence and strict legal procedure without reliance on speculation or extrajudicial pressure. After Elliot Pike was lawfully arrested and detained, the case file was transferred to the criminal prosecution phase, with the focus on finalizing the indictment based on the entire systematically collected body of evidence, including Charlotte Nolan's statements, results of the confinement site examination, physical evidence analysis, tracing data, and expert behavioral assessments. The work of completing the indictment proceeded in a strict sequence, during which the prosecutor reviewed each element constituting the offense to ensure the charges accurately reflected the nature and severity of the alleged conduct, while remaining capable of withstanding adversarial litigation. On that basis, Elliot Pike was indicted on primary charges related to prolonged unlawful detention, deprivation of personal liberty, abuse of a familial relationship to commit the offense, along with aggravating circumstances due to the victim being a minor at the time the detention began, and the continuous extended duration of the crime. The charges were constructed not only on the direct consequences to Charlotte, but also on the elements of premeditation, systematic nature, and comprehensive level of control established through physical evidence and behavioral analysis. During the prosecution process, Charlotte Nolan's testimony in court held a central role, but was not the sole factor, as the prosecutor advocated placing this testimony in close connection with objective evidence to avoid over-reliance on the victim's personal experience. When appearing in court, Charlotte was assessed as having sufficient cognitive and communicative capacity to testify, with necessary support provided to ensure psychological safety, and her testimony focused on key behavioral milestones, conditions of confinement, and control mechanisms that had been independently verified. The trial panel noted that this testimony showed high consistency with the investigation results, contained no material contradictions, and aligned with physical traces collected at the scene, thereby reinforcing its probative value, rather than serving merely as narrative. In parallel, summoned experts clarified the impact of prolonged detention on the victim's physical and psychological condition, helping the court understand that the absence of constant violence did not diminish the severity of the conduct, but reflected a sophisticated and extended method of control. In assessing criminal responsibility, the prosecutor emphasized that Elliot Pike's conduct was not the result of an emotional outburst or temporary conflict, but a deliberate sequence of actions sustained over a long period with the objective of depriving the victim of freedom and maintaining her dependency. The trial panel fully considered all elements constituting the offense, including the defendant's capacity for perception and behavioral control, degree of preparation, systematic repetition, and long-term consequences to the victim, thereby evaluating criminal responsibility at a high level of seriousness. This consideration extended not only to the initial moment of the conduct, but also to the conscious decision to continue the detention throughout 2 years, demonstrating ongoing willful criminal behavior. Defense arguments were recorded and examined in accordance with procedure, but were weighed against the established body of evidence, in which objective elements such as the crime scene, physical evidence, and expert analysis played a pivotal role in clarifying the true nature of the case. The criminal prosecution process was thus shaped as a proceeding centered on individual accountability, where the alleged conduct was placed within a clear legal framework and evaluated on the basis of evidence, rather than speculation or sentiment. The completion of the indictment, presentation of charges, and consideration of the victim's testimony in court marked the phase in which the case transformed from an investigative file into a full legal proceeding, where every aspect of conduct, motive, and consequence was analyzed openly, under the oversight of the judicial system. In that context, assessing Elliot Pike's criminal responsibility served not only to determine the offenses and degree of violation, but also to affirm the principle that abusing a familial relationship and psychological control to detain an individual for an extended period constitutes a serious infringement of human rights that must be addressed with proportionate criminal sanctions under the law. After the trial concluded the adversarial phase, and the trial panel entered closed-door deliberations, the entire case file was systematically re-examined, from the victim's statements, physical evidence, expert conclusions, to legal analyses related to motive, method, and consequences of the criminal conduct, to ensure the final judgment fully reflected the nature and severity of the case. In the conclusion announced at the sentencing hearing, the trial panel affirmed that the acts committed by Elliot Pike constituted the offense of prolonged unlawful detention with particularly serious aggravating characteristics, carried out with premeditation, planning, and continuous maintenance over a period of 2 years, causing profound and lasting harm to the victim's personal freedom, psychological integrity, and normal developmental process. The panel emphasized that the defendant's avoidance of frequent physical violence did not diminish the dangerousness of the conduct, because it was precisely the systematic psychological control, social isolation, and deprivation of self-determination that made the consequences more persistent and harder to recover from. In its reasoning, the court pointed out that abusing a familial relationship to approach, manipulate, and sustain Charlotte Nolan's compliance was a clear aggravating circumstance, as the defendant exploited inherent trust within the family structure to conceal the criminal acts, prolong the detention period, and evade detection by authorities. The trial panel also determined that the defendant possessed full capacity for perception and behavioral control throughout the commission of the offense, with no grounds indicating diminished criminal responsibility or actions taken in a state of loss of control, and therefore bore full legal accountability. Based on a comprehensive evaluation of all elements constituting the offense, the degree of consequences, the extended duration of the crime, and the severe impact on the victim, the trial panel unanimously sentenced Elliot Pike to 35 years of imprisonment, deeming this penalty proportionate to the particularly serious nature of the conduct, and necessary to ensure general deterrence and societal prevention. The court made clear that this sentence was not intended for pure punishment, but to affirm the principle of protecting personal freedom against any form of deprivation, whether through direct violence or through sophisticated and prolonged psychological control. In the same judgment, the trial panel declared the defendant ineligible for early parole or sentence reduction in the initial phase of serving the sentence, based on the high degree of premeditation, the extended duration of detention, and the risk of recidivism in controlling behavior if released prematurely. This decision was reached after the court considered the defense's arguments for mitigation, but concluded that those factors were insufficient to alter the clearly proven nature and dangerousness of the criminal conduct. The trial panel also stressed that excluding early parole was necessary to safeguard community safety and to demonstrate the justice system's consistent stance toward systematic infringements of human rights. In the final pronouncement, the court confirmed that Elliot Pike's criminal record was closed at the trial level once the judgment took effect, marking the completion of the extended criminal prosecution process from investigation through trial. Closing the file was understood as establishing clear and definitive criminal responsibility for the defendant, terminating all legal disputes about the nature of the case within the trial framework, while creating the legal basis for sentence execution. The trial panel also noted that the judgment could not fully erase the physical and psychological harm Charlotte Nolan had endured, but it held significant meaning in restoring legal order, affirming the value of personal freedom, and sending a clear message that prolonged acts of control, detention, and manipulation would not be tolerated in a society governed by the rule of law. The verdict was pronounced in a solemn atmosphere, reflecting the public's deep concern for the case and the justice system's role in addressing sophisticated yet particularly grave forms of criminal conduct. By imposing a sentence of 35 years imprisonment and excluding early parole, the trial panel affirmed the position that justice is measured not only by the degree of visible violence, but also by the extent of human rights deprivation and prolonged control an individual must endure, thereby concluding the case with a judgment that carries deterrent force, establishes clear legal standards, and imposes definitive criminal responsibility. After Elliot Pike's sentence took effect, and the legal file was officially closed, Charlotte Nolan turned 18 in a state of existence that was both stable in terms of safety and fragile in terms of recovery, where her return did not mean all wounds had been erased, but marked the beginning of a long-term process requiring time, resources, and continuous patience. Physically, Charlotte was no longer in critical condition as when she reappeared, but medical evaluations recorded that recovery proceeded at a slow and uneven pace, reflecting the accumulated consequences of prolonged malnutrition, lack of movement, and restricted light exposure. Her body needed retraining to adapt to normal daily rhythms, from basic endurance to regulating sleep and hunger cues, functions that seemed natural but had been disrupted during confinement. In parallel with physical recovery was a long-term psychological intervention process built on principles of stability, safety, and respect for individual pacing, as experts determined that Charlotte exhibited characteristics of complex trauma, where submissive reflexes, avoidance, and dissociation did not disappear immediately once the threat ended. Therapy sessions focused on helping her re-establish a sense of personal control, distinguish between a past of control and a present of safety, and learn to recognize and adjust survival responses that were once necessary but no longer appropriate. In daily life, Charlotte was recommended to maintain a clear but flexible routine, to avoid recreating feelings of imposition, a difficult balance between the need for stability and the right to personal choice. The aftermath of the case continued to appear in small details, from reactions to enclosed spaces, unexpected sounds, to excessive caution in relationships, where trust was rebuilt slowly and selectively. Post-trauma assessments showed Charlotte had good awareness of her experience, but that did not mean the memories lost their weight. Instead, she learned to place them in a past context without letting them dominate her entire present. Remaining limitations were acknowledged realistically and without avoidance, including lower than average stress tolerance, the need to control her surrounding environment to feel safe, and mental fatigue when facing legal procedures or public attention related to the case. Reintegration into education and society proceeded along a personalized timeline, avoiding pressure to catch up immediately, as experts stressed that sustainable recovery is not measured by speed, but by the ability to maintain progress without reactivating trauma. Within the family context, Charlotte was surrounded by protective measures to minimize unnecessary conflict and stimulation, while being given more decision-making power in choices related to daily life, education, and therapy, as a way to gradually restore the autonomy that had been stripped away. Although the case ended legally, its influence did not stop with the verdict. Instead, it shaped a phase of life where Charlotte had to learn to live with memories without letting memories define her entire being. Experts noted positive signs, such as clearer expression of personal boundaries, improvement in identifying emotions and needs, and patience with herself when facing difficult days. At the same time, they acknowledged that there would be periods when recovery plateaued, with symptoms returning under stress, and that this was not viewed as failure, but as part of a long-term process. At 18, Charlotte was not expected to return to normal, according to a simplified societal standard. Instead, the goal was defined as building a functional, safe, and meaningful life in her own way, accepting remaining limitations while continuing to expand her range of choices. Charlotte's current condition was therefore viewed as an evolving state, where recovery was not a straight line, but a continuous series of adjustments, supported by medical, psychological, and social systems, with the focus on protecting autonomy, dignity, and long-term safety. The case's closure created the necessary space for this process to unfold without lingering legal pressure, but it did not erase the responsibility of support systems to accompany Charlotte on the recovery path, where every small step forward held value, and every limitation was acknowledged honestly, as part of the post-trauma reality she was learning to live with, rather than trying to deny or overcome through unrealistic expectations. Charlotte Nolan's story serves as a stark mirror for contemporary American life, where safety is threatened not only by overt violence, but also by sophisticated forms of control hidden within the most seemingly secure relationships. Charlotte was not abducted by a stranger on the street, but had her freedom stripped by Elliot Pike, someone whose familial position was close enough to bypass all initial vigilance. This detail reflects a reality in the United States. Many acts of abuse and unlawful detention occur in private spaces, where trust is exploited and power is concealed under the guise of family or responsibility. The fact that Charlotte was controlled through repeating schedules, severed communication, and psychological manipulation rather than constant violence, shows that violence does not always leave visible wounds, yet its consequences remain profound and enduring, as seen in the complex PTSD symptoms and submissive reflexes she carried upon her return. From a societal perspective, the key lesson is the necessity of community awareness and trauma-sensitive support systems. Families, schools, and authorities need training to recognize signs of control and isolation, even when clear evidence of violence is absent. The way the justice system handled the case, relying on physical evidence, behavioral analysis, and victim protection, underscores the value of a human-centered justice system, where testimony is placed within rigorous scientific and legal context. For every individual in the United States, this story is a reminder that personal safety is tied to clear boundaries, the right to say no, and the willingness to seek help early. For the community, it is the responsibility not to tolerate any form of control that deprives freedom, no matter how cleverly disguised. If Charlotte Nolan's story has made you reflect on the hidden corners of control and the value of personal freedom, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring more cases and the profound lessons behind them. Thank you for watching until the very end. See you in the next video with another story that still leaves us with much to confront and contemplate.